So we got ourselves a Spitfire 1500 in the shop today. We got some clutch hydraulic problems. It's losing fluid out of the clutch pretty quickly. I had to top it off to actually bring it into the shop, and as you can tell, it's dripping quite a bit just in that little bit of time. So yeah, it's definitely got a problem. But we also have some other little issues we're going to be working with, or at least looking at, while it's in here. So some of the other issues he's actually got on his list is the switch here is broken, so sometimes it'll just kind of slip into the flash to pass mode and then run the battery down. And he says the steering is a bit loose and sloppy, but looking at that, it doesn't look as bad as what he was describing to me, so we'll have to dig in further on that to see what's really going on. So when pulling it into the shop, I noticed a lot of tire scrub on the right side when I was turning it to the left. And then after getting it in, we noticed a lot of wear on the outside edge of this tire here. So I'm wondering if he really has an alignment issue going on rather than just loose steering. So I'm going to go ahead and check the camber real quick, see how much positive camber is actually in it, because that's usually what will cause that. All right, we're a good just over 3/4 of a degree of positive camber in this side. Let's go check the other side. About 3/8 of a degree in positive camber in this side. I have to double check what the alignment specs are for this, but I never like to see positive camber in any of these. So like we said in the beginning, this switch here was broken. This is the old one. We've already replaced it. Because just like I said before in another video, I'm working with a new helper, so I'm not getting the footage of everything we're doing. And I'm teaching him how to do things like this. And while I'm teaching him, I'm not getting the footage. So this was floppy. And this is what the switch looks like out of the car. And what you do when you want to take this off is we get this loose. That's I believe a 15 inch and a 16th. Take that loose and get it to where it's basically flush here. And then if it was a standard steering wheel, I'd say you grab a hold of it, put your knee against it, pull up and pull on it. But with a steering wheel like this, I wouldn't. This is aftermarket. I say grab a hold of it here and just pull really hard and get somebody else to give it a pop right here with a hammer. And I want to hit it square, and you want to make sure this is flush, because and you want to leave that on there because you don't want to hit just the end of this, because you can mushroom the threads and cause problems. But if you leave this thing on there flush, the nut will help protect the end of the threads, as long as you're hitting it nice and square. But you don't want to beat the snot out of it. If after a couple of firm love taps, shall I say, it doesn't come loose, then you want to stop and resort to go ahead and using a puller on it. But the other reason why you want to leave this on here is because when you're pulling, as soon as that thing pops loose, it's going to pop out. And you don't want to just go boom and hit yourself in the face with a steering wheel. So then once you get the pop loose, you want to make sure this is sitting nice and straight so you can orient yourself. And you can pop it loose. Then you take this off. There's 2 screws on the bottom that are Phillips, and they're pretty long screws. And once you get those out, it's just you unhook the connectors for both of these switches and pull the wires up through here and get them. And there's a bolt that goes right through here. This tab's broken on this one, but there's a bolt that goes through here that's a pinch bolt that holds it to the steering column. You loosen that, and it's just a Phillips screwdriver, and then just pull the whole thing off. Once you get that off, if you're not replacing the other switch, then there's 3 screws here. Take those 3 screws out and then reinstall this switch onto the new one, the new turn signal switch. And then when you slide it back on, there is a little like notch here that this slides right up inside of here. You want to get that lined up, that holds it into position, and then slide it and make sure it goes all the way on. This one was a little finicky. It didn't want to go all the way on, because if you don't go all the way on, when you put the steering wheel on, it'll push against this and jam this up. Now when you go to put the steering wheel back on, there are these notches. With the factory steering wheel, they're wide and they just fit in there. With the aftermarket steering wheel, they're just roll pins. And you want to turn this to where it lines up. What this thing is this is what cancels your turn signal. So when you turn your turn signal on and you turn and you go come back, it pops it back. Same thing this way. And that has to line up to those slots. So then when you get this thing lined back up, make sure it goes all the way and goes into the slots. And if you don't have it lined up right, you can just pull this off, readjust this, and then go again. And then I go ahead and put these on finger tight. Go take it for a test drive. Make sure the steering wheel is actually centered and feels centered while you're driving it. If it doesn't, then you can pull over, pull into a driveway, depending on what kind of road you're on. Take it loose, move it 1 notch, put it back on, and then keep driving. And then you can get it perfectly centered. And once you got it right, then you actually final tighten it, and you're done with that job. Now I waited at this point on this car to assess the steering because I wanted to go drive it first. I wanted to feel driving it, how bad does this feel? Because he thinks it was the actual U-joint or the rag joint, whatever you want to call it, up close to the rack there. And I'm not so sure that that's what it is. I think what it actually needs is the steering rack re-shimmed, because it doesn't feel like there's a lot of slop, and grabbing a hold of that joint, it didn't feel like it was moving much. But what's exasperating the situation on this, I think, is actually the front end alignment, because the car is really twitchy. So we will have to check the toe end, because if the toe end is square or toed out slightly, it'll make the car really twitchy. You want it toed in just a tiny bit, and you can check the factory manual. It'll give you settings on it. Now I don't use the exact settings in the manual because I'm using toe end bars, and my measurement's adjusting to account for the bars extending past the tires. Now when he brought this car, one of the other things he was complaining about is it would not idle. And no, it would not idle. And for the test drive, I just kicked the idle up a little bit just to get it up so I wouldn't have to screw with it, and then I'll mess with the carburetor later. But first thing I do, anytime I'm messing with a Stromberg, is check the oil. And see, there was nothing in it. It was dry when it showed up. And that is not actually that uncommon to see that, especially on the Strombergs, because there's an O-ring on top of the adjustment screw, or around the adjustment screw for the needle. And those can perish and leak and suck all the oil into the engine and burn it off. And it's not too uncommon when you see that and the owner doesn't know, or he has somebody works on it who doesn't know it's supposed to have oil in it, and they try to tweak on the carburetor, they screw up the adjustments on the carburetor because they're trying to account for the fact that it's going lean, because without that it'll just go lean and stumble and spit through the carburetor with no oil. So that's one thing we're going to have to address. Probably putting an O-ring in there, and then this thing's running really rich, so it's probably got a warp choke, which is really common on the Stromberg. So that's my starting point on this. Make sure we got no oil leaking, run through the choke assembly, and then we can adjust it. All right, so now we got the Spitfire up on the rack, wheels off, and we're going to check out stuff like the brakes and the steering, because he was complaining that the brakes squealed a lot, and it's not necessarily that uncommon of a complaint. There's been a lot of iffy pads in the market for years. I've had some cars come in the shop where you go to push on the pedal and it's like they don't stop. You feel like you really got to shove your foot right through the floorboard, give it a really good hard shove for it to even really slow down at any kind of reasonable rate. And 9 times out of 10 on those, just throw a new set of pads on and it's fine. It's just crap pads. Now, you can have the same thing with squealing pads. Just it's the makeup of the pads usually. Now this is a tip that can help you with no matter whether it's Spitfire or your daily driver Honda. If you have brakes that are squealing under light braking, low speed, it's usually because of brake dust buildup in the brakes. Now you see this stuff here. This is all new, fairly new stuff here. But they're squealing and the pads almost full thickness. What you can do is you can actually, when you wash the car, is actually go in, squirt in through the wheel, make sure you get the rotor washed down really well while the brakes are cold. Never do it after you've been driving it, or you can warp the rotors. And flush out any of the brake dust that might be in there. And then next time you drive it, if there's no squealing and then it comes back in a couple hundred miles, it's just the makeup of the pads you have on the car, and probably changing pads to a different brand will likely fix it. That's probably what we're going to end up doing here, is putting a new set of pads on there to get rid of that squealing. One of the things that I did notice when I got this thing up was this is the oil pressure switch. Now, the only thing the oil pressure switch on these does is it kicks a light on. It's actually within the speedometer when you have low oil pressure. And low oil pressure is roughly, I think 5 pounds on these is when that kicks on. So when you turn your key on, that light should be on. When you start it, it should go out. And then they also have this tied into the anti-run-on valve. So when you turn your key off, it sends power to the anti-run-on valve until the oil pressure drops below 5 pounds, then the anti-run-on valve shuts off. This is the wire for it. Now we might go ahead and hook that back up and see what we get so that it's operational. Whenever I see something like this, it always makes me question why. You know, did they just not know? Or, you know, wonder what the oil pressure reading actually is on this motor. Now this thing does have 95,000 miles on it, so it's extremely likely this motor's been rebuilt already, because these had a tendency to have number 3 rod bearing give you problems, you know, spin rod bearings, and at around 60,000. That's really common on these. Now looking at the paint here, the paint on the block is really fully intact and good, and it's a red valve cover, which suggests, yeah, it's been rebuilt. Because these things would have left the factory, I believe, with an orange, like a reddish orange, or a blue valve cover for the States. Apparently, Triumph used different valve cover colors so they knew what the engine was. So a California emissions car would be a blue valve cover. 48 states would be the orange valve cover, and probably home market would have been either silver or black, something like that. I'm not really sure because I'm in the States. So we're addressing the steering portion of the car here, the loose steering feel, and this is the part that the owner was told was bad on it. So he had one in the boot ready to go. So the idea was that these rubber donuts here, or bushings, would deteriorate, and then it creates a lot of slop. Well, once I got this splash pan out of the way and can actually see up in there, because when I looked in there I didn't see any slop here, what it turns out is all the slop is coming from where this shaft goes into here. The pinch bolt isn't tight enough, and the shaft is just working like this. And I don't really find it surprising. You know, actually these days, I'm surprised when I do find something surprising on these cars. But my guess would be that that bolt was never properly done up from the factory, and it's been loose like that for years. And installing the new one could be a problem because the splines could have enough wear on it now that they may not even want to go into this one. So I'm going to start out with just tightening it up and see what that does. If I can get a good camera angle in here and get the light in there right, I'll get you a view of it moving. All right, this is probably the best angle I'm going to get. There is a little bit of movement in this, but most of it is back on the shaft. So you can see it. So the shaft is moving a lot before it even picks up the joint. But then you can see there's some slight movement in the joint itself.